So I'm going to show you a little bit of how this rig is operated. So you can see there's a bunch of numbers right here. And what these numbers are going to tell us is just give us an idea of where we want to hoop things based on the size of the shirt, as also where the seam lays. So I've mentioned in previous videos that number 15 is where I normally start, because a lot of shirts, especially men's large and extra larges, with a typical seam would be right here. But again, because we use the top for our seams, we could adjust when we're having our seam sitting up here, because the seams can be further down or further back. That's how we would adjust. So, and that's why we could either go down for seams that are higher up. We could go up for seams that are lower down. So it's a little bit backwards when you think about it. And then, you know, I might be hooping an extra small shirt here at 9 or 13, but by the time I get to that same style in a 3X or a 4XL, I might be out here at 16 to 20 because of how I want it to lay. Because what I want it to do is I want the center of my logo to be roughly in the center of the middle of the shirt and the shoulder sleeve seam over here, which is why we have to move inside or out. Now I will say one thing that I was taught is if you're in doubt, you always want to err on further inside and maybe even a little high, just to be safe, because you don't want it sitting into someone's armpit or down in the middle of their chest. So what we have to do is to be able to use this rig, we got to take this part off, move to the side, and then we have our two pieces. This one right here has a little lid that just slides right on. And then this one, what we're going to do is we're going to put them into these pegs, not the big one at the top, but the very next peg. And we're just going to put these screws into the holes. So as they go in, then we want to tighten it so it stays in place. And then what we do, since we don't really know what to do for this, is we actually just take the other part of the magnet. It's going to be on the bottom of our, and just for the moment slide it into place. And then on the back side is where these are, so you've got to tighten them back here. Same on the other side. And then we can put our backing into its place. And now we've got that. So I'm going to show you the different types of backing that we use when we're hooping basically everything other than hats. And so what we do is got 3 types of backing, and then we have Solvy, and we'll talk about what that does in a second. So one of the main backing that we use is a cutaway backing. And if you notice, there's 2 sheets for all of these. I always use 2 sheets, except hats is an exception because I fold it over, but it's got a double layer. But just to make sure that it's nice and secure, we always use 2 sheets. And some of them are easy to identify. This one is going to be a little bit thinner looking. This is our performance backing. These look about the same if you're just looking at them. This one's a little crumpled because it's been used. But if you kind of pull them up, you can kind of start seeing a little bit different. This one's a little bit more dense. But if you look at it from the side, it's also a little bit thinner. So the obvious difference between these two is that this is a cutaway backing and this is a tearaway backing. So a lot of times what we'll do is most items where it's inside the chest or on the sleeve, we can use a cutaway backing. But for things like jackets and blankets and towels and obviously hats as well as like beanies, we'll use a tearaway because we don't want to leave quite as much behind it. So here's our cutaway. This is one we use most often. I use tearaway probably the second most. And then we have a performance backing here, and you can see the obvious difference. And this is actually a different style than we would sometimes use, but it's also a thinner one like this. This is for those really thread dense logos, especially on dry fit shirts. So we often use this, especially for proper shirts, as well as some cornerstone polos when we're doing our sheriff's office logos, because they're very dense in their thing. That way it's not creating a bunch up on the outside of the shirt and causing where it looks like it's kind of pinched in together. So those are our 3 backings that we use. This one's also a cutaway backing. So we've got the 2 cutaways, obviously for most items for performance, and then we have our cutaway. And then we also have our Solvy here. And this actually, while these all go behind the fabric, this lays on top of the fabric inside our hoop. What we often use for these is for items like beanies or blankets or towels that kind of have a fleece, or even fleece jackets, like a fleece surface. And what this does is it just gives an extra layer for the thread to sit on, so it sits a little bit more. So for a shirt like what it's got behind it, we wouldn't need that. But because a towel might have a little bit of the fluff, almost like a carpet, this lays on top of it to kind of give it a little bit of a raise so that it's not so deep inside of it. And that's what we would use Solvy for. And this also, some of it, if it's a big piece, you can tear it away. And then you would actually, for a lot of customers when it's a little bit dense, it's called Solvy because it's water soluble. So what we can do is we can take a spray bottle and a paper towel and we can spray it out and dab it and get rid of that thing. And so a customer may not even know that you ever had to use this if you've done it correctly, but it does help you to make sure that the logo looks great on its fabric. All right, so I'm going to show you a little bit about our hoops, to show you a little bit how when we adjust our tension. So what we have here is we've got a little wheel here that you can turn to loosen tension or to tighten tension, depending on how your thing is facing. It'll be opposite. What I typically do is there's a little text here on all of the hoops, and towards you loosens it, and then away from you tightens it. Now when we would do this is depending on our type of backing. So if we're using a performance backing or a cutaway backing, we would tighten it a little bit. You know, we typically sit about in the middle if we're going to do a cutaway backing. Now, the one danger is if you make it too loose, it may not fit inside the rig, so there's a little bit, and it could pop off your hoop really easily. But I just wanted to show you this because there are times, like when you do sleeves or when you do beanies, that even though you could be using a cutaway backing on some of those sleeves, because it's not going to fill up the whole hoop, it means it's going to have extra gaps here, and then you actually would also make it tighter. But I just wanted to show you a quick little video of how to tighten or loosen your hoop. And some of the ways you can tell is, obviously if you're hooping an item and it's popping off before you put it on the machine or while it's running, then you've hooped it too loose and you need to tighten it. Other times if you're trying to hoop something, and I can give you an example right here. And even though I don't have any backing here, if I've made this too tight, because this is a thick item, I might have a hard time getting it in. See, this one wasn't too bad, but if I had some backing in here, let me add some backing. Because it's a thicker item potentially, especially if you're doing like a denim. I've had problems with denim, or if you're hooping it over a pocket and it just creates an extra layer of fabric on top of it. If you've got it too tight, you're gonna have a hard time pushing. I'm trying to push and it's not going in, which means it's a little too tight. So I would need to come in here and loosen it. But again, if I loosen it too much, and I do the same thing, you notice how easy it goes in. But then when you got to think about it's in there, it looks like it's okay. But when you think about being on the machine, it's going to be coming down between 800 and 900 stitches a minute. So see it on the immediate knock, it knocked off. So that's why we want to make sure our tension is perfect. So again, if it's hard to push in, you need to loosen it. And if you can pull it off very easily like it just did, then that means you need to tighten it. And that's just a little idea of why we need to know how to adjust our tension on our hoops. All right, so we're gonna learn how to hoop polos. So we've got a rig that's available here. So I'll show you how to use the rig and the type of backing. So the first thing we're gonna do is we'll grab the inside of our hoop and we'll lay it inside. Now one thing that depending on the type of fabric, you've got this ability to adjust here to make it tighter. If it's a thinner fabric or a thinner backing, which we'll talk about later, or regular, this is a pretty normal one, so we're gonna leave it kind of in the middle. You put that in, you pop these off. We're gonna use standard backing for this. So you're gonna put it in here and it clips. And then what we wanna do is, we try to, with polos, we want to generally have the logo centered on the third button. This is for most men's polos. Women's polos might be a little different. And what I do is to get it straight, is I make sure I line the seams up on the top of this rig right here. And then what I want to do to make sure that it's in the right location is when you can push these down. This is roughly the center of your hoop, and so I see that it's higher than the button. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go in here and move this rig around. So I'm going to move it down and potentially out. So it's There's a standard number, which we typically start as around 15. And you would adjust that number. Basically, these are numbers down here. You would adjust these numbers inside or out based on the size of the shirt and how the shirt's laid out, depending on where the seam is up here. But again, I'll lay the seams across the shoulder here. Make sure this is nice and straight. So I pull this down. I don't want to make it too tight, but I don't want it to be super loose either. So I try again, still a little high here above the button. So I'll go down another one. Same thing. And I know I'm getting a straight, horizontal straightness by putting the seams up here. But in order to make sure it's straight, also I can kind of eyeball the edge of the seam inside this to make sure that this is a straight line as well, so I know the logo is straight. And I'm now on the third button, so I'll take the rest of the hoop and I make sure that these holes are facing down, because that's how it's going to go on the machine. And it's got holes here that's going to lock into these up here. So you put it in here. Now it's locked in place, so it's not going to move. And this thing pushes down, and as I push it down, I'm going to lightly spread the shirt. I don't want to pull it too tight because it could affect how the logo lays. But I'll lightly pull the shirt, and then I'm going to push it all in as evenly as possible, but often I'll start at the top because it's just more natural, and then just kind of finish on the bottom. And you can pull it out. And then what I'll often do is I'll check inside to make sure I didn't catch any of the shirt around the edge of the hoop, because some shirts have things that hang down, and you can do that just by feeling it yourself. And there is a left chest hoop. So I'm going to show you how to hoop right chest on the rig after we've already done it on the left chest. So all we have to do is, just as we always would, put in our hoop, put in our backing, and then we want to pull our shirt across. And because we did this, we know that this is going to be right on the center. If this was a broad-end one, we would have to, what we would first do is we would mark this on this side to make sure that it was in the right place. But since we did this in-house, we'll know that it's right at the third button. So we're going to use the third button as well to do the right chest. And as we've done with the left chest, we see that these is kind of where the center of our hoop is. Third button's down here. I can see the height's a little off, so I'm going to move this down until I find the right height. While I'm lining up my seams at the top, keeping it nice and straight. So that's pretty close. And so what you can do, just keep adjusting it until you get right on it. So we're right on it. We use this little seam along this edge to make sure we're straight on this side. Plus you can see this logo over here to make sure that's straight here. Take our rig, slide it into place, and then the center of our silver here should go across the middle of this logo. Lightly pull on the edges and push. Pop it off. Make sure we didn't catch any of the edges. And that's it. So now we'll show how we can hoop t-shirts and put them on the rig. We want to make sure we know where the centers are. So what we're still going to do, just like as we would if we were hand hooping this, is we're going to measure down from the seam after we know it's straight. We're going to measure down to our 9. We're going to mark it. And now what we can do is on our rig, we'll take our hoop, we'll put it inside of our frame. We'll pop these up so that we can put our backing in behind it. And now, unlike in Polos where we had a third button to line it up, we don't have that, but that's why we put a mark on it. Because now what we can do is we pull our shirt across. Is we'll still use our seams up here to make sure it's straight. Now because we don't have a center seam, we're going to have to make sure that as eyeball as best as possible that the center of this line is in the center of the neckline. Again, we can use the armpits to make sure it's somewhat straight. But after we find that, now what we're going to do is we're trying to make sure we line up these with our dot. So obviously we do this, we notice it's way too high. So we'll come down. We'll try another number, we'll line it back up again. So we're a little bit closer to the right height. And this doesn't have to be exact because we don't have to worry about matching a third button, but obviously this dot just gives us a good idea where we want it to be. And then one thing we can do is we can slot in our hoop. also see where it would lie. So for instance, on this shirt, our dot is a little further inside as well. So instead we'll take our hoop back off. We'll slot in a little bit earlier. We're gonna go down one more. We'll line up our seams again, make sure our shirt's nice and straight. And as we put it in, now it's not necessarily perfectly exact, but it's pretty close to being the center of our hoop this way as well as this way. And as we do with the rig, we'll then we'll push it all in together, pull it up, and there's our hoop. And again, double check to make sure that we did not catch any of the shirt inside here. All right, we're gonna show you how to hoop a jacket using our rig, with our magnet hoops. So what we've got to do first, we've got to mark our jacket. So I kind of use the sizes as a gauge. So I know this is a unisex large. And so I'll measure down from the seam with our inches. And I know I want to be roughly here at the 8.5 mark, so I'll mark it here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pull our rig over and use our magnet. So we'll show you how to do that. Now some jackets, and this is a jacket that does have it, have an extra pocket inside of the jacket that's specifically for hiding embroidery backing. So if you unzip the jacket, you'll see it actually has a port pocket. So we actually have a second zipper here that we want to pull up. Now obviously not only have it, but you see it's going to hide back in here and not be a problem. The only thing about hooping in these type of jackets is what we don't want to do is when we're hooping, we don't want to make sure that this extra layer doesn't get caught underneath, otherwise it could stitch it together and then the pocket is now unusable. So what we do is inside where we've done the second zipper is where we're going to slide this around the rig. We're going to pull this through. We've got our hoop here in the middle. And what's difficult is it's hard to find. You've got to be able to tuck this little part underneath it so that you can get your straight edge of your zipper. But if you tuck it in too far, it could get caught by your magnet. Thankfully on bigger jackets, you don't have that problem, but the smaller jacket gets, you might have an issue. So what I'm doing is I'm actually basically bunching up as much as I can this extra pocket behind so it's close to the edge as possible while still using my zipper as a straight edge. So see, I can do that here. Pretty much all of it is going to be outside of the hoop. And I'll attach my hoop on the top so that I can make sure that I get it straight when I have it in place. And I can use my arms here to pull down on the sides of it to kind of straighten it out. So what I do, this jacket gives me the ability, because of where my dot's going to be, like the bigger the jacket, I can go higher up on this hoop, and I just have to pick things that are straight edge. So I use straight edges at the top of this black. We could use the gold. We could use the lines if it's that big. So for this example, I'm going to be able to use the top of this black. So I get it nice and straight. I see my things in the middle. I'm going to pull down as best I can here with my arms, and then I'm going to use my chin to lower the hoop. And then what I can do is make sure it's straight. And these seams are a little deceptive sometimes because they're not very straight. They actually curve back down. So we really can't use the seam as a judge. What we can do is just look at the side of our zipper and show. And with the magnets, you have a little bit, if you're not entirely sure it's straight, you have a little bit of give that you can kind of pull on the magnet. It's going to tighten here, and it'll also make sure it's straight up here. But because of this pocket, what I want to do is I want to check underneath and make sure this extra part is not caught. And you can see it's slightly caught in the magnet, but what I can do, because it's on the very outside and the magnet's powerful enough to hold it, is I can slide it out. So I just slide this out so I know none of it is caught. My magnet has still hold, there's all that, there's nothing in it, and now my pocket edge is completely out and it's safe and it's not going to sew anything together. All right, we're going to hoop a backpack. So what we've got to do is we've got to put it right here on this pocket. So what we've got to do is find our center first. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure across here to give myself a center. So I want to lay this as flat as I possibly can. I like to use the centimeter side just because it's easier to find the middle. So for instance, this one's 23.5. So instead of coming and trying to find it with a bunch of 5/8 or anything like that, I'll come right in here into the 11.75. I'm going to mark that, and that's just going to be a rough spot from that way. But then I also want to measure down here to make sure that it's pretty close to center. Backpacks are a little different. We don't necessarily have to be centered because we don't really low down here anyways. Also, the size of the logo might depend where this is. If this was a big logo, we might keep it where it's at, but if it's a small logo, we might move it up a little bit. But we'll do the same thing, we'll lay it flat here. So really, our center is about down here. But unless we're using a really big logo that needs to be right there, we're gonna keep this tall one just because it gives us an idea to keep it nice. And more than likely, it's gonna be a name, so we're gonna have this sitting here. So that's how we mark it. And then in order to hoop it, what we do is we've got our other rig, which we can use a magnet on. So we've got our bottom side of our magnet, and we slide it in here, and pull these up so we can put our backing in. And for backpacks, I use tearaway backing because it's just easier than trying to get in and cut it. So as we've done with everything else, we'll put this here, put our little marks down. And then what we have to do is we're gonna unzip this pocket because obviously we don't want to sew this together. So we're gonna unzip this pocket. We're gonna tuck the backpack underneath here and only bring this above. Now, because it's not a very long item, we can't really use these lines as a measure of if it's straight or not. So what we have to do is we'll use whatever thing we can, which generally we'll use the bottom right here of the black to make sure that this part is as straight as possible. So what we'll do is we'll pull it up here. And we know that we can at least go there, which is good. So then what I'll do is I'll add the top of the hoop and slide it into the grooves where it's locked in place. And then I've got to use the black to bring this nice and straight, and this is going to hold it here. And because you get to a point where you really don't have extra hands in order to pull it down, because if you let go, it could slide away, and then we don't know if it's straight. The way that I was taught to do it and just continue to do it is just hold it in place and use my chin to push the magnet down into its place. And obviously I've lined up my blue dot in the middle, so there it is. And then now that I've got it in place, I can come in here, push these down, pop this off, and make sure that it's all clear and didn't catch any of the rest of the back. And that's how we hoop a backpack. I'm going to show you how to hoop using our rig using a short sleeve shirt. So the first thing I want to do is I want to measure up the seam of the shoulder to get my center of my logo. So a lot of times, and this always depends on the logo as well, but most logos are pretty small, about 1 inch. So I just need to measure up just a little bit. And on these, I'll often use inches just to give myself away a little bit more. So I'm actually going to put it about 2 inches up. And then what I can do is once I get on my machine, if I think it's a little too high, I can always bump it down. But mostly what this is to show is the center of my line is going to be for when I hoop it. So what I want to do is I want to put my shirt through here, pull it right through. I'm going to put my backing inside, right underneath. And what I can do is, because I have it, since it's a short sleeve, I have a nice straight line here, so I can use these lines on the rig to make sure that it's straight, make sure that, while I can also use the line, see through the shirt of where my line comes through to make sure that my dot's in the middle. And because it's a sleeve logo, I want to adjust my tension, make sure it's a little bit tighter, because again, it's not going to cover the whole of the hoop, so it's going to fall a little differently. If I don't make it tight enough, it might pop off if it's too loose. So I've got it in there, and then I'm going to take my hoop, and I've got the lines up here that I'm going to use to measure on the very edge of my sleeve. So I'm going to put it down, so I can already tell I'm a little bit outside of it. So I'm going to go inside, because then I also want to use my up and down right along this seam. And depending if the logo is bigger, now what I can do actually, instead of using the edge of the seam for this logo, I know it's probably a little smaller. So I'm actually going to use this first seam right here of thread to put my lines right on those lines. Make sure it's centered. And then I come down and I hoop. And then I want to make sure that my backing is all caught and that my backing's in the middle of my area, because I obviously don't want it to be hitting just plain shirt. I want to be around the backing. It looks like it's good. That's how you hoop a short sleeve shirt. I'm going to show you how to hand hoop a long sleeve shirt, even though not many people get logos on long sleeves. Some people do, so we got to make sure we know how to do that. So what we're going to do, where a short sleeve would have a nice seam here that you could just measure up from the seam. Obviously a long sleeve does not have that. And so a lot of times what I'll do if I'm doing a long sleeve is I'll go ahead and measure a similar size shirt in a short sleeve, so I know around where the logo should be. So it would be right above their elbow on their long sleeve, because that's where most people want it if they want it across there. And so I've already done that, and I know that I want to be about 18 centimeters down. So I was going to lay the shirt out flat like this. So I've got the seam comes all the way down. And thankfully, when you get most new shirts, there's already a crease from where you get it. Now, if someone brings one in, you can always heat press it or something to lay it out flat, so you give yourself a nice seam, a nice crease line. But since I'm down 18, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the seam up here. I'm going to measure down 18 down the shirt. And then I'm going to mark it as close to the middle as possible. Obviously, I can't mark it right on it because of it's laying on its side at the moment. But roughly, I've got my dot right here along the seam. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a rig to make this a little bit easier. And I'm going to hoop this. Now, the smaller the shirt, the harder this gets. But for a shirt like this is a 3XL. This makes it a bit easier. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my neckline. I'm going to go in through the neck, and I'm going to pull the sleeve along the rig. So right now, only the sleeve is what I've got right here, along the bottom and the top. And because I've got this nice crease, I can use that crease to line up along the little line that you can see through the shirt, which is to help me with a straight line. And I want to get as best as possible there to start, because once I add my backing, it's going to be harder to see that line. And then most logos are pretty small when it comes to sleeves, so we would have our backing cut in half. We'll slide it through the neckline as well. And then what I can do is, because it's a little bit difficult to get it behind, I'll get it kind of close on the initial push, and then I'll just kind of hold the shirt in place and kind of bump it down and just kind of scoot it through the shirt as best as possible, because I want to get it as close to the center as I can. And once I'm there, so I've got my edges of my thing here, there's my center, there's that. Now I need to add my hoop. So I'll do the same thing. I'll pull this up. I got to reach in a little bit. I'm going to hold it in place so it doesn't move. I'm going to grab the backing here so I know I'm going behind it. It's going to move just a little bit because I can't keep the pressure on when I'm putting the hoop underneath it. But now I've got my hoop and my backing in a similar place. Again, I'm going to keep using my seam here. Even though I've lost the side of the line because of the stuff that's behind the shirt, what I can do is I can have an idea of my seam here, and I can still use the edges of this to know my center, and I can use the top of this to know my center to know that I'm pretty close. And then once I actually use the hoop, I'm going to try to line up the lines on my hoop with the seam so I know I'm going straight down the logo. So what I'll do is I'll put it in, and right now it's a little high. And what I've got is I've got a seam here, so I'm going to put my lines on these seams as best as I can. Might have to scoot it just a little bit, inside or out, to make sure that I'm right on them. And this is going to be a little touchy at times because it's such a thin part of the shirt. And once I'm there, now ideally you'd also want to make sure that your dot is across the center of here as well. Thankfully, with most sleeve logos, they're a little smaller, so if you're just a little off, as long as you're straight up and down, it'll be okay. And once I'm straight here, going to the top, push the bottom. And then I gotta pull this off slow this way because I don't want it to pop back off. A lot of times I'll make sure I push around the edge of the hoop to make sure it's fully on there because I couldn't get the same pressure that I wanted to on it if I was hand hooping it. And then I want to walk behind it and make sure that it did not catch any of my shirt in excess around the edges. Make sure that my backing is about in the middle. Make sure it got caught on all the sides, and that's how you hoop a long sleeve shirt using the rig. So we're gonna be hooping a full front on this is a sweatshirt. So I've already got my rig ready. So first I gotta do is I gotta make sure I mark my center. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll have these measurements saved on previous orders, but if this is a new order, I would take the size of my logo and I would center it roughly on the middle of the chest. I don't want it too high, so I'll bring my fingers down. I don't probably want to go any higher than about 3 inches right here. So I could measure down, I could mark here and then measure down to the middle of my logo. If my logo is 4 inches tall, I'd want to measure down 2. And then I could also use my armpits here to make sure that I'm in the right spot. So for this particular one, I know I want to go down actually about 6. So I'm going to start up here, measuring from the seam straight down. A lot of times it's kind of hard to see in the video, but you can actually see the seam going down the shirt, so you can actually just measure down that seam so you know you're in the middle. And then we mark it. And then what we'll do is we're going to take our shirt and we're going to pull it over our rig. And as we've done with other times using the rig, is what we want to do is we want to line up our seams on the top. Sometimes this one in particular has little, underneath the seam it kind of lays over, so you actually have to like kind of pull the piece back underneath it. It's kind of hard to see, but there's this little part that can fold one way or another. So when you have it in this situation, you actually want to push it back. That way it's sitting on the same on both sides. So I've got my thing. I can use my line here to make sure that I'm down on my dot. So I've got my seam, got my dot. And then when I put this in, because they smack together, I want to just slide this in the top. I see my line is on top of my line here. And then I want to come down and make sure that I stay on my line, which is right there. See if my middle is about the same. And that's how you hoop a front. So I'm going to show you how to hoop a full back. So I've already got my rig prepped and ready. And then while on the fronts of these, I would have marked it on the back, because I'm just going to use the shoulder blades, which is roughly right across the middle. I really don't need to mark it. You could if you wanted to. You could measure down, about halfway between these two things and mark it. But doing these often, I know that the way my rig is going to sit on my rig, because of my seam, it's going to be basically where I want it to be. So all you do is going to take it, slide it across the rig here. And then I want to make sure my seams are on the shoulders. And while it's hard to see, there is a little black line right here in these shirts. A lot of these things, because of how they're folded, they'll have a little seam down it, so I know that it's right there. Which again, if you really wanted to, what you could do is, maybe not for your height difference, but just so you know that you're in the middle, you could mark that seam. That way you could line that mark up with your line. You could also do it by eyeballing the sides here. Like once we put the magnet on, you'll be able to tell if this side has obviously more space than the other, then maybe you went one way or the other. But for our example here, I've got it marked right on the line. And then I'm going to put this into the top. And then attach it on the bottom. And then what we want to do is on these, so I'll look and I'll see that my seam is right here, and the middle of my logo right here is going to go here. So I will adjust the height based on the logo. So a lot of logos that go on the back is just one line of text. If it was, I would actually scoot it up a little bit, not too close to the hoop, but it would go right across the shoulder blades. But this would be perfect hooping if you had, like we do ones that have two lines of text, and this would be right across the middle. It'd be right across their shoulder blades, not too low, not too high. And that's how you hoop a full back. All right, so I'm gonna show you how to hoop a towel using the rig. And this is for customers who want their logos down in their bottom corners. Now, if we were doing it in the middle, it'd be a little different here. But for the ones that want in the bottom corner, what we want to do is we would know the size of our logo already, roughly probably 2.5 to 3 inches. So what we would do is we would find our center, because we want to make sure that it doesn't get too far down here. So we would measure up and kind of give us an idea. If it's a 2-inch logo, it'd come back here. So I might want to go up a little bit more to start right here. And I went straight up from this so that it looks pretty close to the middle, and I can always measure across here and make sure that's roughly the same on both sides to make sure that it's in the middle. So I've got about 17.5 on both ways, so it's roughly in the right place. Although it looks a little odd just because of these stripes here, but that's where I was wanting to put it. Now, if they had requested for this not to be here, we would have measured up straight from here instead, just so that it was on this particular part and didn't interfere with this right here. But then all we do is, after we've marked it, is we'll take our rig, which we've already set up, and we'll pull it over the top. And then what we want to do, because of the angle that we're doing this at, it's hard to tell which way it's straight besides a little bit of eyeballing it. So one of the ways that I can do that is I have to eyeball here, but I'm going to try to use the corners of these to help show that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down and I'm just going to barely touch the edges of these, or I could even go a little bit more where they are just inside of them to make sure they're here. And sometimes what you do on these is, because of the angle, I want to make sure that my bottom is here. But you might sometimes have to hoop these and then take the hoop off and then try it again just to get a little bit closer. But once you get used to it, it won't be quite as bad. Now in this example, I don't have Solvy on this, but if I was doing this, I would certainly put Solvy down to help with the logo because it's on a towel. And after I put this in, I'm gonna knock this down here. And then what I can do is I'm gonna check where my lines are and see like this one turned on me a little bit. So you can see this edge comes here almost to this line, but this one's below it. So actually, even though this might look straight and it's here, it's not straight here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pop it right back off. I'm gonna pull it around a little bit. And we'll do it again. And so now we look at it, we see we're just short of this line here, just short of this line here. So it's about as straight as we're gonna be able to get it. And then we would line it on our logo and run it. And that's how you hoop a towel. So we're gonna hoop a blanket at the moment. So this is gonna be a little different than what we've done on other parts because we could do this with a hand hoop, but we can actually use the rig, which we'll get to in a second. First thing we're gonna do is still mark where we want this to be. So according to our order, the customer wanted this to be 1.5 inches off the thing. So I've used their center seam as the measuring part. I could always measure across if I wasn't sure, but they've got it already folded in the middle. So actually what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a light little mark on the edge of the 1.5, just so I know that's where I wanna start as the bottom. And what I have is I've got a 2-inch tall logo. And so what I wanna do is find the center. So I'm gonna measure down 1 more inch. And that's gonna be where I focus on my center. So now that we've got our center, now we have to hoop it. So what we do is we've got a rig here, a little different than what we've used in the past. What we do is we can use this for our big magnet. So we'll take our big base of our magnet, we'll slot that in here. We'll then take, so for this kind of stuff, I use tearaway backing because we don't want to leave a lot of extra backing around for something like a blanket. We just want the tearaway to be where the logo is. So same as we do with all the other rigs, you put it where it goes, you flip the black things back down to hold it in place. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our blanket and pull it over. Now what we wanna do to try to make this as straight as possible, which this is a handmade one, so it's not gonna be perfectly exact, but typically what I would do is I would use these bottom seams across the base of this, or I could pull it down here if I needed to, just to know that I have it straight. Now with this one, you can see up here that the thing's a little bit, so I'm gonna have to eyeball this a little bit more than normal. So I'm gonna pull it straight. And even though I can't see the center of my thing, I know that roughly here in between these 2 dots is the middle, so I wanna get it as close to the middle as possible. This logo is not really huge, so it's not as important. And then what I do is I've got the magnet, now that I've got it where it is and I think it's straight. Because these snap together really hard, I'm gonna let the magnet catch, let the magnet catch on the top, and then I'm gonna slowly reduce it down to the bottom. And then what I want to do is, because I've got this thing, to make sure it's straight this way, I can also use the seam again. Seam, you can't really see it, but it's right here next to this. And it's pretty close down here, this one, so I've got a pretty good idea using that it's straight. I can also use different markers wherever you need to use on the sides to make sure it's straight. And now I've got it hooped. Now we're going to show you how to hoop a hat using our little hoops here. So what we have to do is first we got to attach our hoop here. So you're going to hear a clicking sound once it's in place. And it clicks on both sides. You'll see it kind of catch. So we need to lock it in place. We can pull it. We know it's in there. Now one thing, as we showed with the hoops, that we can check, we can undo these screws and move this up or down depending on the type of hat to make sure that it's nice and secure. This should be a good part for the hat we're doing today. So for these, we take our backing, instead of using 2 sheets of backing for other ones, we actually just take this and we fold it over on itself. So now we have our 2 sheets, and I also do an extra fold here just to show that I basically the center of my thing. Now what I've got is I've got a line here on the top of this hoop, and this is where I'm going to use as a center for the seam of my hat as well as the seam of my backing. So I'll put my backing here and line up my seam with that part. And then I'm going to take a hat. So most hats you're able to undo the back, or they're fitted hats and are loose enough to do that. I'm going to pull up the inside of this hat so that this doesn't get sewn to the hat. And then I'm going to slide this on. So I'm going to put this on first up here. And I'm gonna try to keep my backing in place where my center seam stays here. I'm also gonna line up my seam of the hat centered here. I'm gonna slide this in. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull back here to make sure it's not catching on this bottom part. I'm gonna pull this all around here. And then what I have to do over here is I'm gonna pull my teeth around. So if you wanna come to this side, what we'll do is we're gonna take the edge of this, we're gonna slide this under this little silver bar here to make sure it's getting caught. Because we want these teeth, we don't want it to be, in order to make sure it's straight, we want it to catch this little seam. So we'll lay the teeth here, we'll go inside of our hat. We're gonna pull this across, and what we're doing is we're trying to make sure our teeth go across the bill so we know that it stays straight. And then on this side, if you wanna come back over here, we're gonna take the same thing we did on the other side, we're gonna take this as far down here as we can because we want these teeth to catch the same on the other side.
My hats are so fun.
And then we catch this right here. And then we're gonna pull tight here. Now one thing we wanna make sure is when we pop this off, which we hit these two red buttons, is to make sure we didn't catch too much of the mesh on either side. This one looks like it's good. We know that it's across the full base. And then we know that our hat is straight. So I'm gonna show you how to hoop a hat when you're putting a logo on the lower left or the lower right. So for this illustration, we'll do one on the lower left, which would be right here. And so the only reason why this is a little different from our normal is because of where our backing is going to be. So typically when we would put our backing, we put it right here in the middle. The only problem is some logos are a little bigger, and if we were just to hoop our hat how we typically would, then and leave our stuff here, there's going to be on the edge where the logo comes through and it doesn't hit any backing. So one way that we can do this to avoid this is we leave our backing in the middle like we typically would, and then when we come in to actually put our hat on, after we get it fully around in our places, and because I run these one at a time typically, I'm not as concerned with this being in the middle because I'm going to run them by themselves. But once I have it on, one thing that I can do is I can then pull. But the problem if you just pull like this, the reason why I don't like doing it this way, is if you just go ahead and pull now, the backing has gone with it. So it's basically hooping it the same, you're just going to be hooping it off center. So instead, what we want to do, if I want to do lower right, is I want to go ahead and prep it to be on the edge. And that way, when I put on, and I can check to make sure this is the length of where my seam is. Now I can put the hat on straight on like I would prefer to do it. And even if my hat moves at this moment, and the backing moves with it, it will still be in its appropriate place. So you still hoop the hat and everything else, but because I put my backing over there, you can see inside here that it's going to cover from side to side, so no matter where that logo is inside of it, it's going to hit that backing. Because again, if it was in the middle, your logo might come out here and then it hits no backing. That's how you hoop a lower left or a lower right. Alright, so I'm going to show you how to hoop the back of a fitted hat. So first thing we're going to do, because it's not going to catch the bill, is we're going to make sure that we change our tension here on our hoop. So right now it's at its loosest. I'm going to move it to the other side and make it its tightest so that it catches. And then after we put it on, just like we would everything else, we're going to fold our backing just like we always do. And then most fitted hats have a little thing here that they catch. So when you try to do it, it'll fold up weird if you don't cut these out. So you just kind of slide in. They have these little things where they're going to cut these seams just like we do here, and then we come to this side. And we just cut the other one, just right in there. And it doesn't cut the actual hat, it's just a little seam. And once it cuts, it'll pull. So now you can tell that it's further, see they were connected here, now they're a little bit further away. And then what we do is just like we would for a regular hat, we'll pull this aside, pull this out like we've did in the front. And then you slide on, just kind of shimmy it on. And we're gonna use this seam to line up with here. And then you do the same as you would for another hat. So you're gonna pull, you want the inside of this to be what you're using. And since there's no bill and we've already tightened it, what we're just gonna do is we're gonna slide this underneath here, and it's gonna pull a little bit. And then we're gonna take our little metal, we're gonna slide it underneath here to kind of hold it more secure. And then we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. We're just gonna pull it underneath the edge. And then we want it to catch. And then what we're gonna do is make sure, so see, like this one came up a little bit on this side. We wanna try to make the edge of our hoop right along the edge of this. That way we know that we have a straight line. So, and some hats, because of their size, do a little bit more maneuvering to get it where it should. And then once all my edges are caught, and I feel like I'm pretty straight, then I will tighten my edge. And now you can just run along and see that it's a straight edge. That way we know this is going to be straight. I'm going to show you how to hoop the back of an adjustable hat. So we've got our clamp here. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull it in the back here. We're going to lock it into place just like we would a standard hoop. And once we've got a hoop like a standard hoop, we're going to pull our lever right here, which is going to pop up this part of the clamp. And then what we have to do is we've got to slide in our backing. So I fold it over just like we would if we were hooping a hat on the rig. And then I'm going to detach the hat. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my fingers to catch this, and I'm going to shimmy this back. So I've got to make sure these get underneath in between the things. So I'm going to catch with my fingers the edge of this, and then I'm just going to kind of slide it back, right, and just hold it in place. And then basically one of the measurings that I use after I use this to pop it back down, if you can get it where you mostly can, you can kind of shimmy it inside of it. And what I do often is the little seam that's on the back of this hat will be right here where these little silver teeth are. And then what we just have to do is you've got to kind of pull it to make sure that this line is straight. So because there's no actual lines to use, there's 4 of these here and there's more here, but I'm going to pick right in the middle is where I want the seam to go. And then a lot of times hats will have the little knocks back here that you can use. This one does not have it, but they'd have it up here. That way you can kind of gauge to make sure it's straight. But as long as your line here is straight and it looks about this even on both sides, you'll know that it's a good straight hat. And then what you'll do sometimes if it's sitting up, you still got to like lightly pull to make sure that that's how you can adjust to make sure it's straight, and also just to make sure it's pulled nice and tight so it doesn't catch. And that's how you hoop the back of an adjustable hat. So this is how you hoop a knit beanie. So because I've got this little lip here, what I don't want to do is I don't really want to hoop it back here because it's harder to get onto the machine that way. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take these inside out. And I know from doing these that I want to put this tag face down. It's almost always on the left side when it's face down. And I want to measure it like this. So we've got the inside of the hat, but weirdly enough, this is the part that's going to be on the outside of the hat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, as I've done before, I'm going to line it up on the edge. I'm going to use the little hem here as a thing. And then what I can do is I can actually measure on these from here to where the lip starts, and it's about at 8. So I'm actually only going to mark this about at a 4. So I know it's right in the middle. And after I've got it marked, then I can slide it onto my rig. I've got this lined up straight with my dot. I'm going to add my backing in. And I'm going to try to make the top of my backing flush with the top of the beanie so that I know that it's completely covered where my logo is going to be. I'm going to slide my hoop in and adjust my tension as needed to make sure it's a little bit tighter to catch, but not too tight where you can't hoop it. And then we want to lay our Solvy across. Again, I'm going to make it flush with the top of the beanie. I'm going to put use the rig to use the top of my hoop to put it in. I'm going to line up these lines with the top of the beanie and make sure that my center line is right across this dot from top to bottom. And once in there, I'm going to push the top and push into the bottom. And then what I've got is make sure it's not caught. And what I've got now is I've got my thing done. And because of how this is hooped, because it sits on the outside, we actually won't even have to flip our logo, even though you think you're flipping it upside down. Our logo will still run as it typically would from top to bottom here, because this again will be on the outside, even though this is the inside of the beanie. So I'm going to show you how to hoop a skull cap beanie. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lay this, and what I want to make sure I do is, because I want to hoop the front, is I'm going to check in here to see where my label is and make sure it's in the back. So I see where it's at. I want to be laying it on the, it's going to be on the bottom. So I want to make sure that basically it's on this side. That way I know that's the back of my beanie, although they can be worn differently. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to measure. So I'm going to line up the straight edge of my ruler up here. I'm going to use the seam down here. And most beanies, especially ones that are regular knit caps, have the little lip. And you generally only have about 9 centimeters before you're at one edge of the other. So most logos, what we do is we just measure to a certain part. You could do this, depending on your logo, you might change your height just drastically. But some of my bigger logos, for instance, I know are normally about 9. So what I do is I mark about here 4.5, and I do this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my beanie and I'm going to use my rig. So I'm going to pull this onto my rig. So first I get it positioned. So what I'm using is I use the straight line here because I marked my center. I can also use this to help me. I'm going to slide in my backing, which I use tearaway for beanies. Because again, it's just easier than having to cut and without leaving much there to worry about for the person wearing it later. And I put it in. And the one thing I'm going to do here, because most beanies have this kind of texture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use some Solvy as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hoop and I'm going to tighten it just a little bit because it's not catching backing across the whole hoop. It's only on a certain part of it. So I want to make sure this is nice and tight. So what I'll do is I'll tuck this behind the backing. I'm going to try to make it as centered as I can. Normally I put the ring right here on the line. Try to make sure this is a good height. And I can always move this later. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my Solvy across this because I want to hoop my Solvy inside of it. You could put it on top of the hoop when you're running it, but a lot of times your Solvy will fold over. And then when you go to spray it out, it's a little thick and harder to get out. So I'm going to lay a single layer so that it's nice and tight. And then I'm going to lay my hoop in as I always do. So I'm going to lay it down right here. And I've got lines up here. And what I want to do is I want to put these lines on the top of my beanie. So like a line here and a line here. And while I'm doing that, I want to make sure that my lines here line up with my dots. So what I'll do is I'm just going to kind of shimmy it up a little bit, not too much. And when I go to tighten it, it may move a little bit. So I want to give myself a little bit of space. So I'm getting it pretty close to the edge. There it is right there. And I've got my lines on the side lined up and I have my line here lined up, pushing the top and with both hands down. And I pull this off. I want to make sure that my backing is right across this part because I know that's where my logo is going to go. It's okay that it's not here because my logo is not that big. We've just got the gap here and that's why I made it tighter. We want to make sure it's nice and tight, so I'm going to pop off. It's good to go there. And then we want to make sure that we didn't catch any more of the beanie on the edges.